Well, I want to thank our witnesses very much. As you're well aware, we have votes going on right now, but with the chairman's guidance, we shall continue here out of respect for your time. We'll begin with my own questions. As other members roll in, we'll entertain those. But Mr. Kuchner and Ms. Massimino, thank you so much for your leadership. This is such an important area. We're shining a national spotlight on the importance of it, and I'm just so grateful for your efforts. Do you both agree, as you work on this issue, that the State Department's annual Trafficking in Persons report is a valuable resource in your efforts to fight human trafficking and the scourge of modern slavery? Yes?
Yes, absolutely, we do. I do.
And presumably...
You can't solve a problem if you don't know how big it is.
That's right. So presumably we want that report to be as accurate and as comprehensive as possible, right?
We do.
Okay.
Yes.
These are what we call leading questions in the profession, right? So tomorrow I plan to introduce a piece of legislation called the Department of State and United States Agency for International Development Accountability Act of 2017. The legislation is needed to provide this committee greater transparency regarding the more than 180 General Accountability Office recommendations for the Department of State and USAID that haven't been fully implemented. And among the recommendations are at least 2 or 3 recommendations pertaining to this very area about which you and so many others are passionate. The legislation will enable Congress and this committee to conduct even more effective oversight, something we can always improve upon. It would require state and USAID to provide a timeline for implementation of these anti-trafficking proposals as well as other proposals. And it would ensure that any GAO recommendation that is not implemented, we're certain as to why that is, given some rationale for that. So given the large number of open recommendations, it would be my hope that most would be implemented and that we can get bipartisan support for this effort. So I'm inviting members of both sides of the aisle to work with me on this legislation. We'll be dropping it tomorrow. I'd like to ask both of our witnesses about the growing impact of sexual exploitation, forced labor, what we generally call modern slavery, here in our own country. Some of my thinking on this issue is informed by good work that has been done in my own state of Indiana. With the leadership of the Indiana Attorney General, our former U.S. Attorney, and now so many other stakeholders in our state, we have put together a report in our state, the 2016 Indiana State Report on Human Trafficking. Typically, we ask for unanimous consent to enter this into the record. I consent to have it entered into the record. And I think this will be instructive to further your efforts and those of others who are working on this issue. This was the product, this report and the related initiatives in my own state of Indiana. It was a product of a public-private partnership to address the unique challenges that our state and others are facing. The report indicates that the Coalition of Service Providers served 178 trafficked youth in 2016 alone. 178 people in my home state of Indiana. Of those youth under age 21 served by Indiana providers statewide in 2016, nearly all were girls, 94%. As a father of 3 young girls, I feel particularly passionate about the need to address this. But I note that this is something that afflicts both genders as well. The report found nearly 30% of those impacted are 15 or younger, and more than 10% are between the ages of 12 and 14. All of my children are younger than that. In Indiana, victims were as young as 7 when first trafficked. These statistics are, of course, heartbreaking. They speak to the broader challenges we face nationally and internationally. If you could each speak to whether the trend lines in the state of Indiana are reflective of your findings across the country. With respect to
with respect to sex
the
trafficking,
ages, the gender.
So most studies have found that the average age of entry into sex trafficking is about 12 years old. And I think most of the numbers that you're finding in your state are accurate. I would, relative to the legislation that you were alluding to earlier, I would like to ask, then what? So we measure it, we know it's a problem, but then what? And then what are the consequences if the reporting isn't there? And what is the consequences if they don't use the tools, if the tools aren't being used? I'm just curious about that relative to that legislation.
I'd be happy to indulge that question. So working with the chairman and the ranking member and people on both sides of the aisle, I think we should make every effort to make sure that the State Department has a specific, concrete plan of action, comprehensive in nature, that would arrest this problem internationally, since that's the focus of the State Department. We also need to have a domestic, a range of solutions to this. And then we need to resource. We need to resource our action plans at the state level, at the federal level. I know that's been a point of emphasis in your own testimony. Here on this committee, perhaps the first step is to see that members on both sides of the aisle continue to work to push an authorizing bill, something the chairman has really shown some leadership on recently, and to the extent we can include human trafficking and other things moving forward on that, that's part answer to your question. So, Ms. Massimino, do you have additional thoughts on the trend lines in Indiana versus the country?
I do. I do think those are reflective of what we see. I also want to say I think it's really important, the state-level focus on trafficking. This, as I said, is a big global problem, very complex, and there are lots of different ways we need to tackle it. But it's really quite important. That sounds like extraordinary leadership at the state level to be tackling these issues really kind of close to home. And one of the things that you heard from both of us is the importance of reporting is for the purpose of being able to measure progress, right? And to get data so you know what strategies are working. One of the things that Human Rights First has been really focused on is making sure that state and federal law enforcement have the resources that they need to go after higher up in the food chain, if you will, of these criminal enterprises that are exploiting people, both on labor and sex trafficking. Labor trafficking cases are a much smaller percentage of the overall prosecutions that happen, but they're a greater percentage of victims that are in the labor trafficking area. And they're much more complex and expensive cases to bring, but they're really important. And I think that Congress should pay particular attention to making sure that these human trafficking prosecution units are well funded and can work in coalition at the state and local and federal level law enforcement to integrate the solutions to those problems. You also mentioned the public-private partnership piece.
I did, and that was my next question, so thank you for anticipating it so that I don't have to cut into the chairman's time now that he's re-entered the room. Maybe you could speak to the importance of that, each of you. I know, Mr. Kuchner, you mentioned it in your testimony as well. IPATH is the Indiana State Report on Human Trafficking, and the entity it created to help fight this scourge in our own state. It's a not-for-profit initiative. There are over 75 organizations statewide focused on collectively addressing this issue, and perhaps you could speak to the importance of these sorts of public-private partnerships in addressing modern slavery, each of you. Thank you.
Sure. Just to touch on the point that Elise was making, I think another thing that shouldn't be lost is the focus on demand prosecution in the space. These are victims. you said it yourself, that these kids are 12 years old, 13 years old. Yeah. That's not a criminal, that's a victim of a crime. And if we're not prosecuting the buyers, if we're not prosecuting the traffickers, not just for trafficking, but that's statutory rape. And it should be treated as statutory rape and prosecuted as rape. And I don't think that we do a good enough job yet of addressing that issue in that way.
Do either of you have thoughts on what we might do to bring more of these individuals to justice, to prosecute them?
Well, it's my understanding that there's an initiative underway currently that will address this within the judiciary system, and I think that the best thing that we can do is to support that initiative.
Continue to support that. Yeah.
I think also making sure that these safe harbor provisions that have had so much bipartisan support here in Congress that would protect, treat victims like victims are very, very important. The public-private partnership aspect of this, I think, is absolutely key. You know, there's a lot that government can do and should be doing, that all governments globally should be doing and collaborating together on this. But as Ashton pointed out, the supply chain issue, the pipeline into slavery, we have to be looking at that. And so I would say the public, there should be kind of 3 Ps in this public-private partnership. It should be also the private sector companies, American companies in particular. You know, when I talk about American leadership on this issue, I don't just mean the American government. I mean all of us. And in many places in the world, American companies are the American brand. So making sure that we enlist those companies, especially now that you all have passed legislation that amends the Tariff Act, which for decades allowed for this importation of child-made and slave-made labor through this consumptive demand loophole that was in existence. You have closed that loophole down, and that is a potentially transformational thing in the world of human trafficking. Now we have to make sure that it's enforced, that the Department of Homeland Security enforces it, that companies understand what they need to do. And most companies don't want anything to do with slavery, but many of them don't understand what they need to do to look at their supply chains and make sure that there's no forced labor in there or no child labor. So we have to come together to talk about that. And one of the things that you all could do, a report was due to you from the Department of Homeland Security, I think back in August, on how they're implementing this very important new provision that you passed, and it hasn't been submitted yet. So I would urge you to ask for that, and we would love to come in and talk with you about it.
Well, thank you. Thanks for your ideas and again for your counsel on this, and we'll continue to stay vigilant, even when the Klieg lights are off, and that's really the important thing with respect to our oversight role. And thank you so much for this opportunity. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.